Welcome to Sera History. I am so glad you are here, because today we are not talking about a king, not a war, not a battle, not a revolution. We are talking about something far more terrifying than any of those things. We are talking about a company, a corporation, a business, a group of men sitting in offices in London, wearing wigs, drinking tea, and, almost accidentally, conquering an entire subcontinent of 300 million people. Yes, a company did that. And the craziest part? They started by just trying to sell pepper. This is the story of the British East India Company, the most powerful, the most ruthless, the most world-changing private corporation that has ever existed on this planet. And honestly, compared to these guys, every villain you have ever read about in a history book looks like a confused intern on his first day. Let us go back, way back, to the year 1600. Queen Elizabeth I is sitting on the throne of England. England at this point is not the grand empire we think about. It is a mid-sized European country that is frankly a little jealous of Spain and Portugal, who have already carved up most of the world between themselves. Spain has the Americas. Portugal has the spice trade routes to Asia. And England is sitting there going, okay, what do we get? Spices, by the way, were not just flavoring. In the 1600s, spices were money. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, these things were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. Europeans had no refrigeration. Their meat went bad. Their food was terrible. A little nutmeg could make the difference between a meal that was edible and a meal that tasted like sadness and leather. So spices from Asia were the oil of the medieval world. Whoever controlled the spice trade controlled the economy of an entire era. Portugal was controlling it through their route around Africa. And they were making a fortune. A group of English merchants sat down one day and said, "We want in on this. We should form a company, pool our money, send ships to Asia, buy spices cheap, bring them back, sell them for an enormous profit, and become fabulously wealthy." This is, in the grand scheme of history, one of the most understated business pitches ever made. On the 31st of December, 1600, Queen Elizabeth signed a royal charter creating the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. That name was a mouthful, so everyone just called it the East India Company. The charter gave them a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. Just like that. One signature, one document, and a private company now had the legal right to be the only English business operating across half the known world. They raised around £70,000 from investors. Today that would be tens of millions. And they built ships and set sail. Now here is where it gets interesting, because the East India Company spent its first few decades just trying to survive. They went to Indonesia first, to the Spice Islands, but the Dutch were already there and the Dutch were absolutely not interested in sharing. There were violent confrontations. There was what is called the Amboina Massacre in 1623 where the Dutch tortured and executed English traders, and eventually the English decided, fine, Indonesia is not for us. So they turned to India. India in 1600 was not a poor, struggling nation. Let me say this clearly because a lot of people get this wrong. India at this time was one of the wealthiest places on earth. The Mughal Empire, which ruled most of the Indian subcontinent, produced something like 25% of the entire world's GDP. Think about that. One empire. 1/4 of everything produced on the entire planet. The Mughal Emperor Akbar had a court that made the courts of European kings look like village fairs. The wealth, the art, the architecture, the food, the trade, India was the jewel of the world. Literally. The word for wealth in many languages came from India's reputation. The East India Company showed up at the Mughal court essentially as beggars with hats in hand, asking politely if they could please maybe set up a small trading post. Just a little one. Very small. No trouble at all. The Mughals, being enormously powerful and not particularly worried about a few English merchants, said sure, why not? You can have a trading post in Surat. Do not cause problems. The year is 1608. The East India Company has a tiny factory, which is what they called their trading posts, on the western coast of India. They are buying cotton, silk, and saltpetre. They are selling wool and silver. They are, by every measure, a minor commercial operation in a country that barely notices them. Nobody at this point would have predicted what was about to happen. The 17th century passed and the company grew. Slowly, steadily, they established more trading posts. Madras in 1639. Bombay in 1661. Calcutta in the 1690s. Each time they negotiated with local rulers, paid taxes, played by local rules. They were merchants. They were supposed to be merchants. But merchants need to protect their goods. So they built walls around their trading posts. And then they hired guards to man the walls. And then they trained the guards. And then they bought cannons for the walls. And then they started training actual armies. And you know how it goes. One day you are a shop with security guards, and the next day you have a private military that rivals the armies of European nations. This is not an exaggeration. By the mid-1700s, the East India Company had its own army. A private army. Not the British government's army. A company army. Paid for by shareholders. Commanded by company officers. Fighting company wars. At its peak, the East India Company's army had 200,000 soldiers. That is twice the size of the British Army at the time. A private company. 200,000 soldiers. Let that sink in. Now we have to talk about the moment everything changed. And that moment has a name. The Battle of Plassey. 1757. India by this point is fracturing. The great Mughal Empire that once controlled everything has weakened dramatically. Regional rulers, called Nawabs, are increasingly independent. There is conflict everywhere. And the East India Company is watching all of this very carefully. In Bengal, which is today the region spanning Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal, the Nawab is a young man named Sera History. He is 23 years old, he is impulsive, and he is very, very suspicious of the East India Company. He has noticed that they have been building up their fortifications in Calcutta. He has noticed that they are arming themselves. He goes to them and says, "Stop fortifying. You are merchants. Act like merchants." The company ignores him. Siraj-ud-Daulah does not take this well. He marches his army to Calcutta, captures the city, and locks a group of English prisoners in a small jail cell overnight. Many of them die in the heat and suffocation. The English called this the Black Hole of Calcutta, and it became a massive propaganda event back in Britain, used to paint Siraj as a monster. The company sends Robert Clive. Robert Clive is one of history's most fascinating villains. He came to India as a clerk, a young man who was supposed to sit at a desk and write numbers in ledgers. He was so miserable at this job that he attempted suicide twice. Both times his pistol misfired. He took this as a sign from God that he was meant for something greater. He was right, in the most morally complicated way possible. Clive turned out to have a genius for military strategy. He was bold, ruthless, and completely unafraid. He rose from clerk to military commander and became the company's most dangerous weapon. At Plassey, Clive faced Siraj-ud-Daulah's army of around 50,000 soldiers with a force of just 3,000. The odds should have been ridiculous. Clive should have lost. But Clive had been busy writing letters. He had made a secret deal with Siraj's own commander, Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar would betray Siraj during the battle. In exchange, Clive and the company would make Mir Jafar the new Nawab of Bengal. Simple as that. A private corporation had conspired with a military general to overthrow a sovereign government so they could install a puppet in his place. The battle itself lasted barely a few hours. Mir Jafar's troops stood still and did nothing. The few loyalists who fought were overwhelmed. Siraj fled and was later captured and killed by Mir Jafar's men. Mir Jafar became Nawab. And Bengal, the richest province in all of India, fell effectively under the control of the East India Company. What happened next is where the story turns from dramatic to genuinely horrifying. The company did not come to India to build. They came to extract. After Plassey, they essentially became the tax collectors of Bengal. The right to collect taxes, called the Diwani, was granted to the company in 1765. This meant that the agricultural revenue of an entire province, millions of farmers and their harvests, now flowed directly into company coffers. And the company used this revenue to buy Indian goods to export, which meant that India was, in effect, paying for its own economic exploitation. The company was not even spending British money anymore. They were using Indian tax money to buy Indian products to sell at profit to the rest of the world. It was a system of extraction so elegant in its mechanics that economists still study it today. And then came the famine. The Bengal Famine of 1770 is one of the most catastrophic events in Indian history. A drought hit Bengal. Crops failed. People began to starve. In any normal situation, a government, even a flawed one, would reduce taxes during a famine, would distribute stored grain, would take emergency measures. The East India Company raised taxes. They needed the revenue. They had shareholders in London expecting returns. The dividends must be paid. And so while Bengal starved, and historians estimate that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Bengal's entire population, roughly 10 million people, died in this famine, the company continued extracting. There is a letter from a company official during this period that is one of the most chilling documents in history. He writes almost casually about the bodies piling up on roads, about entire villages being emptied, and then pivots to concerns about whether the tax revenue will be adequate that year. 10 million people. And the primary concern was the quarterly numbers. This is the moment I want you to really sit with, because this is what happens when profit becomes the only objective. When there is no government accountability, no public interest obligation, just shareholders and dividends and revenue targets. The East India Company was not evil in the mustache-twirling, laughing maniacally sense. It was evil in the banal, spreadsheet-driven, bureaucratic sense. And that kind of evil is actually far more dangerous because it does not feel like evil to the people doing it. It just feels like business. Back in London, there were people who were alarmed. Edmund Burke, the great Irish-British statesman, gave speeches in Parliament that went on for days, literally days, arguing that the company was committing atrocities. He tried to impeach Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of India, on charges of corruption and cruelty. The trial lasted 7 years. Hastings was acquitted. The company had enough money to have very good lawyers and very friendly politicians. Meanwhile, the company kept expanding. Through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, treaties that were then violated, and a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse, which essentially said that if an Indian ruler died without a male heir, the company would take his kingdom, the East India Company absorbed more and more of the subcontinent. By the early 1800s, the company controlled more territory than any empire in the world. They were not just merchants anymore. They were rulers. They had courts, they had jails, they had their own laws, they ran universities, they operated the postal system, they built roads and railways, all in service of making the extraction of wealth more efficient. And they employed people of all kinds. There were genuine visionaries among company servants who built institutions, promoted education, translated ancient texts, and believed sincerely that they were doing good. There were corrupt officials who made private fortunes through bribery and looting. There were soldiers who served honorably and soldiers who massacred civilians. The company contained multitudes, as all vast human enterprises do. But the system it created was fundamentally extractive, and no individual good deed could change what the system was designed to do. The thing about empires built on extraction is that eventually the extracted push back. The year 1857, everything exploded. It started with a cartridge. The British Army had issued new Enfield rifles to their Indian soldiers, called sepoys. The cartridges for these rifles were greased, and the soldiers had to bite off the ends of the cartridges to load them. Rumors spread that the grease was made from pig fat and cow fat. For Muslim soldiers, pork is forbidden. For Hindu soldiers, the cow is sacred. Both communities were outraged. This was the spark. But the fire had been building for 100 years. The sepoys mutinied. The rebellion spread. It became something far larger than a military revolt. Across northern India, civilians, local rulers, dispossessed aristocrats, farmers who had lost their land, all of them rose up. It was a revolution, a war of independence, a civil war, and a religious conflict all at once. The British called it the Sepoy Mutiny to minimize it. Indians called it the First War of Independence. The reality was somewhere in the middle and more complicated than either label captures. The rebellion was put down with extraordinary brutality on both sides. Atrocities were committed by rebels against British civilians. Atrocities were committed by British forces in reprisal that were, by the scale of death and suffering, far larger. Entire cities were bombarded. Captured rebels were executed by being tied to cannon muzzles and blown apart. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. When it was over, the British government looked at what the East India Company had created and made a decision. The company was too dangerous to be left in private hands. In 1858, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company. Queen Victoria assumed direct sovereignty over India. The British Raj, the direct rule of the British government, began. India would remain under British control for another 90 years, until 1947. The East India Company, as a political and military entity, ceased to exist. It limped along as a tea trading operation for a few more years and was finally wound up completely in 1874. 274 years. That is how long the East India Company existed. From a group of merchants pooling their money to buy pepper in 1600, to a private empire that ruled over hundreds of millions of people, to a footnote, to a dissolved company. 274 years of the most remarkable, the most consequential, and in many ways the most troubling story in the history of commerce. So what do we take from this? First, the obvious lesson about power. The East India Company became what it became because no one stopped it early enough. By the time the British government realized what was happening, the company was too profitable, too politically connected, too embedded in the economy to be easily checked. The people who raised alarms early, and there were some, were ignored because the money was too good. Second, the India that the company found and the India it left behind were dramatically different. When the company arrived, India was producing roughly a quarter of world GDP. When the British left in 1947, that share had fallen to around 4%. The wealth did not vanish into thin air. It moved. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was funded substantially by the capital extracted from India and other colonies. The railways built in India were built with Indian tax revenue, using British materials, for the purpose of moving Indian goods to ports for export. The infrastructure served the extractors, not the extracted. Third, and this is the part that I find genuinely haunting, the men who ran the East India Company were not, for the most part, cartoonish monsters. They were businessmen. They went to church. They loved their families. They built homes and gardens and went to the opera. They believed, many of them sincerely, that they were bringing progress and civilization to a part of the world that needed it. The capacity of human beings to commit enormous harm while believing themselves to be entirely in the right is not a historical curiosity. It is one of the most important patterns in all of human history, and it shows up again and again and again. The East India Company is a mirror, and depending on who you are and where you stand, you might see different things in it. But you cannot look away from it and pretend it shows nothing. One last little fact, because I like to leave you with something unexpected. The East India Company was revived in 2010 as a luxury goods brand. You can today buy East India Company branded teas, coffees, biscuits, and chocolates. The company that once controlled an empire now sells gift hampers. History has a sense of humor. It is just a very dark one. That is episode 1 of Sera History. If you made it all the way here, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Subscribe, because we have the entire history of the world to get through and we are just getting started. Leave a comment. Tell me what topic you want next. Conquerors, disasters, lost civilizations, forgotten inventions, famous frauds, legendary battles. This is Sera History, and we are just beginning. See you in the next one.